Hi, everybody. So I'm Paul. I'm from Ireland, and I thought it was a questionable start. There's an Irishman standing behind a bar about to give you guys a talk. I'll try and keep it sensible. This environment is too familiar. Okay. So I spent the most part of the last decade working at Google, at Facebook, now at Intercom, and what I wanted to share is basically a bunch of things that I learned along the way. I had a bunch of different roles. I worked as a researcher on a lot of Google's social initiatives. I worked as a designer. I worked as a product manager at Facebook on a lot of advertising products. As a designer there, working with a lot of partners of Facebook, companies like Nike and Starbucks, Coca-Cola, trying to help them integrate Facebook into different things they were doing. And most recently, about a year ago, I joined Intercom, which is a fast-growing startup based in Dublin and in San Francisco. So I'm going to start at the very, very top, very, very high level, and describe two problems. The first is that people focus on technology rather than what the technology might enable. And this may sound obvious, and the distinction here is quite subtle, but I think it's really, really critical. The first two things are quite high level, so I'll dive into some pragmatic, practical tips in the latter half. I think this is best illustrated through a bunch of different examples. My favorite is probably the invention of the combustion engine. So when the car was invented, people were obsessed with the technology. They thought the engine was really interesting. And just like today, we obsess about different technologies like phones and operating systems, Android, iPhone. If I told you guys I had an iPhone 6 in my pocket, there'll be a rush of people up to see it at the end. I don't, by the way. Just to be clear. But the technology in and of itself isn't the most important thing. Yet it's a thing that we get dragged back to all the time. And I'm guilty of this just as much as anybody else. This manifests itself in ways like people, around a whiteboard or a desk or a computer, saying things like, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? And like, have you seen what this thing does? And that's cool. Everything's quite cool. But no one's actually questioning whether it's valuable or useful. And when the car was invented, it was a very, very similar problem. And what's interesting is that the car in and of itself, or the combustion engine in and of itself, was not at all the most important thing. The most important thing about that invention was that it created a network. It created a network of roads. And it changed how society operates. And it changed how society operates in a bunch of different ways. And the people who invented these things, first of all, the combustion engine, and later on the road network across the US and then across the rest of the world, like these guys here, this is not a dissimilar scene to the one that we find ourselves in, poring over iPads and monitors and whiteboards and so on. But these guys could not really have imagined the change that they were about to introduce into society. The first thing is that the combustion engine led to suburbia. And it really changed how people live. It changed how far away we live from our relatives, from our grandparents, from our best friends. It just changed how far away we play sports, all sorts of very simple things, where we buy food, simple things. And it also changed commerce because it led to big box retail. And this idea that you could, as a business, buy land on the edge of town, which is cheap, build a huge big warehouse, and ship goods to that place. You could get in your car and drive to that place, and you could buy things that were being bought on volume, and you could buy them for very cheap. And so it was very difficult for people who had high rents in the center of towns and cities to stay in business and compete with these companies. And so the combustion engine did that because of cars and trucks and this road network. And it led to dramatic changes in how we think and how we live. A second example is electricity. And by the way, the reason I'm giving you these examples is because I think the internet is going to be even more profound than this. The second example is electricity. And again, people, when we started figuring out how electricity works, we're pretty obsessed with the technology and the ins and outs of it, and there was a lot of experimentation. People didn't realize that in a small number of decades after this, if you were in space, you could actually see where people live because of electricity. Right? That's a pretty profound thing, to be an astronaut and actually see here the Iberian Peninsula and see Madrid and see the northern tip of Africa and actually know that's where people are. And it changed the other things we could do. Electricity led to things like sports, like football, which wasn't around 100, 150 years ago. And it changed how people gather. It changes where we eat. It changes who we decide to eat with. All sorts of different things. So electricity and the road network had dramatic implications for society and how we live. And I believe the internet is going to do the same. And I think it's actually only starting to emerge, how profound this will be, how dramatic this will be. And so the first thing I'm really trying to do is change how you think about the internet as an invention, or change the ways in which you may think that it can solve problems. The important thing is that the internet is really young. It's only about 20 years old. And for any media technology, that's incredibly young. It's literally just emerging. And if you go, one of the things that I did, I guess I learned this while I working at Facebook, was one of the best ways to understand the future is actually to look backwards and start to understand the past and start to understand, what happened when electricity was invented and started to permeate through society. What happened when a telephone was invented? How did society react to that? And what you learn is that these media took a long, long time to develop. They took many decades to stabilize. And the internet in that regard is very, very young. And the internet that we use is in its infancy, and it will change dramatically. And I'll get into that in a second. If you just look at some really, really simple examples, the internet already has changed how we think about news. Right? We don't watch the kind of mainstream news on TV anymore. We don't wait for that to come on TV to learn what happened that day. News is breaking us across things like Twitter. It's radically changing how news organizations work, how journalism works, all sorts of different things. Some better, some worse. It's changed how governments get elected. It's changed how people think about governance. It's led people to think, like, do we actually need a government? Right? Is there a better way? Which is very scary for a lot of people. It changed how we play games. People have played games for many, many hundreds and thousands of years, and the internet is changing the dynamics of gaming and how we play games with other people. It's changed how we buy things. And it's changed how we buy things not only because it enabled e-commerce, it let us to go online and buy things, but it also is changing real-life commerce. Because these businesses have to adapt and stay in touch. Here, Best Buy, for example, are trying to price match Amazon. And so the internet, again, in its infancy, is radically altering how we buy and sell things. This is my gratuitous family photograph. This is, my wife and I have twins. They were born in San Francisco. I lived there for 4 years in Silicon Valley before moving back to Dublin. And so all of my friends and family, I'm from a big Irish family. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters. My 4 siblings, my parents, my grandparents did not experience that birth. Obviously, they were in Ireland, and I was thousands and thousands of miles away. And just a decade ago, they would not have been able to participate in that event. But they can do it today. They did it. And through Facebook and all sorts of different things like iMessage, lots and lots of different communication platforms, it radically altered their experience of that event. It's also changed, the internet has changed how we literally move around the place. Again, just a decade ago, people visiting, I'm here in Malmo for the first time, I would have a paper map, I'd be walking around looking like a bit of an idiot. We don't do that anymore. We don't even think about maps. We don't even think to look at a map before we go somewhere. We just go, we get there, we walk out of the train station, and then we pull out our phones and figure it out from there. So the internet is literally changing how people move around. And of course, that means it changes where they go and how long they spend in places and all sorts of different things. So the key is to try and reframe how you think about the internet and stop thinking about technology and start thinking about what this technology is enabling. It is radically altering how we live and how we relate to others and all sorts of different things. So that's the very, very first, highest level big thing. The second thing, a big lesson that I learned over the last few years was, again, if you look backwards at these other technologies, you start to see that people apply the ways that we work with existing media to a new medium. And we've done it time and time and time again. This is a repeated pattern. If you look at any invention in media or communications over the last few hundred, 500, 600 years, going back to the printing press, even further back to the alphabet, you start to see that we make the same mistakes over and over and over and over again. And we're doing it again. I'm guilty of this just as much as anybody else, and I have to snap out of thinking this way, which is we look at the internet and look at other technologies and try and apply the ways they work. And so, again, I'm not going to go through all these examples. I'm just going to share 2 of them with you, which I think are the most interesting. The first is the printing press. So when the printing press was invented, no one really knew what to do with it. It was pretty transformational. So people looked at the world in which they lived in, and the first thing that they saw was that there was these monks hand-scribing these massive tomes, these massive, massive manuscripts. And so the first thing that people did off the printing press was like, hey, you know, those poor monks shouldn't have to do that anymore. We can just print these manuscripts. You can print these big tomes and save those guys. And what they didn't realize was actually the printing press, you know, went on to become a much more revolutionary technology. This is a pamphlet from the Reformation. This is not a big manuscript. You know, many people would argue that the printing press, the Reformation could not have happened without the printing press, radically transformed large parts of Europe. And the people who invented the printing press didn't realize that. This is like literally 100 years or 200 years prior, because they were looking at existing ways the world worked and applied the printing press to that way. The second example, and it's my favorite example, is the invention of the telephone. So Alexander Graham Bell, who you see here in the front, widely credited as the inventor of the telephone. Some people dispute that, but widely credited as the inventor of the telephone. And it was a very similar environment to it as today, in the sense that Alexander Graham Bell had to go and get funding. He actually had this invention. No one really knew what it was for, and he had to go and pitch it. He had to explain to people what this thing was for. Right? There was other things like the telegraph and newspapers, and there was lots of good ways you know, of communicating and doing things. And so Alexander Graham Bell's pitch for the telephone to raise money was that it was for broadcasting. That was the pitch. That it was for putting on a stand at a religious sermon, at an event, a music event, and broadcasting that event to the world. And that people who had a telephone would huddle around it, not unlike this picture here, and listen to that event. Right? So the telephone was for broadcasting. And that's because, you know, Alexander Graham Bell was thinking about the way that the world worked at his time, and one of the dominant themes, of course, was mass media, the emergence of mass media, things like newspapers, and so broadcasting dominated how he thought about his invention. And of course, I don't use a telephone for broadcasting. I'm sure none of you guys do either. So the internet. The internet is going through a very, very similar thing. The predominant way people think about the internet is pages, but pages come from books. Pages come from magazines. Pages is the way lots of media work today. But the internet is a much more interesting medium than that. It's much more powerful. It's much more transformative. And it's much more like the networks, like the road network, the electricity network. It's much more like those networks than it is like pages from a book. Marshall McLuhan, who I'm a big fan of, explains this better than I ever could. He described this back in the 60s, looking at electric media like TV, the emergence of TV and different things like that, as walking backwards into the future. We're all walking backwards into the future. And I think that's exactly what we do today. We obsess about technology, we think about what's cool and what's latest and newest, and then we apply it to the way the world works today. And as a result, create many things that people don't use. So that's the second thing. To stop applying your ideas to how the world works today. The much more important opportunity, the much bigger opportunity, is to think about how these inventions, how this technology will change society going forward. So the question is how you do that. It's obviously very, very difficult to guess the future. I certainly avoid having to try and guess what the future will be. But we have to make plans. We want to build things. Product people need roadmaps. We need to decide what features to scope in and scope out, and a whole bunch of different things. So at Intercom, we use a framework called Jobs to be Done, which I'll go through in a second. It's pretty new in terms of its adoption. It's actually not that new. It's been around for quite a while. But it's pretty new in terms of its adoption. And if you look in the startup community, a lot of people are starting to think about jobs to be done. And if you look in the user research communities and user experience communities and design communities, you'll start to see that a lot of people are abandoning things like personas and starting to think about jobs to be done instead. The key to this is that you focus on jobs. You don't focus on technology or product categories or personas. So this is the thing, jobs to be done. It frames tons and tons of what we think about at Intercom. So I'm going to read out this quote from Professor Clay Christensen, one of the biggest proponents of jobs to be done. He describes it again better than I could. He says, people don't buy things because of their demographics. Nobody buys something because they're a 25 to 30-year-old male with a college degree. but rather because they go about living their life and some situations arise in which they need to solve a problem. And so they hire a product to do the job. Some of you guys may know Clay Christensen. He wrote The Innovator's Dilemma, which is a hugely successful book. Really eminent thinker in technology. This is really, really important. If we look at how we think about the world, one of the biggest problems that startups have when they're trying to raise money is that the investors will ask them what their product category is. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. And it's really, really difficult to answer that question when your answer is, we have a new product category, or we don't think about product categories, because a lot of the investment community just wants to be able to compare you to other things in the world so that they can figure out evaluate if you're going to be successful or not. So they're looking at for very real reasons, they're looking at the way the world works today. But again, I think that's missing the bigger opportunity. So here's an example. A lot of us think of personas, and we think about segmenting people into different categories. So things like 25 to 30-year-old male has a college degree, doesn't have a college degree, income, demographics, psychographics, some behavioral attributes, a whole bunch of things like that. And we create these archetypes or stereotypes, in some cases, of people. And then we try and design for those people. And I've increasingly abandoned that way of thinking. And there's lots and lots of examples why. I think it's much more important to focus on the problem, not on the people. Here's a perfect example. On the left, the left picture here is obviously a mother and a daughter. You can imagine a scenario in which the mother's daughter is going off to university, maybe in a different town. So one job she has is, I need to stay in touch. We need to stay in touch. On the other side, you've got a teenager. This teenager's in South Africa, very different from an Asian mother, and one of her best friends is at camp. She has exactly the same job. I want to stay in touch with my friend while she's at camp. These are radically different people, but they have the same job, and designing for that job is much more important than designing for those people. And one of the, if you look at data across these massive, massive social networks, if you look at things like what do people do on Facebook. One of the things you'll see is that many, many people from dramatically different backgrounds actually do the same things. They have the same jobs. They want to see what happened last night because they weren't there. They want to see photographs of their family at a picnic because they weren't there. They want to stay in touch with people who they love who live far away. Right? These are human things. These are people things. These aren't narrowly categorized to like one type of person. So it's really, really important to not think about personas, and to think about the problems people have, and really, really deeply, deeply pull at those problems so you can really understand them. The second thing is to not think about product categories. Here's a perfect example of why. All these companies belong in the social analytics category. So the first thing people do when they start to categorize themselves that way is think about what companies are these? What features do they have? Do we need those features? Right? It's basically a big race to the bottom. It's a race to building really complicated products that have lots and lots of different features, probably that nobody will use. One of the ironies of people emulating competitors is that they copy their mistakes as much as they copy their successes. So it's really, really important to not think about product categories. This is a brilliant quote from Ryan Singer, who works at Basecamp. Identifying what a product category is outsourcing your strategy to the past. Right? It's again that idea of looking at the way the world works today or the way the world worked before and applying your new ideas, your creativity with that frame in mind. You're just not going to see the same results. I love this example. This is a great example to highlight how jobs works. This is obviously on the left-hand side, business class, airline. On the right-hand side, you have Skype. These are competing products. They're basically solving against the same problem, the same job, which is something along the lines of, I need to stay in touch and work well with people that I work with who are not nearby, who are not here in person. Right? So there's two ways you can do that. And I'm sure many of you guys have experiences of working with people who don't live or work beside you. And many, many bad stories, I'm sure, to share about how it all broke down. One, you can just get on a plane and fly there and work face-to-face, and it will be far more productive. Or you can get on Skype and a whole bunch of other tools and try and do it that way. So these compete. They compete for the same customers. And if you're an airline and you start thinking like this, it just radically alters the way that you see the world. It radically alters the types of things you do. You stop obsessing about what food is served in other airlines and is it better than your food. You stop thinking there's this market to capture of people who fly business class, and you start thinking maybe we can get more people who use Skype to actually get on our plane. Right? The number of people who use Skype is so much bigger than the number of people who fly business class. Right? It just radically alters how you think about the problem and the market opportunity. This is one example from Intercom, the only example I have, but I'm including it because I think it really highlights this well. We work against jobs, and we design against jobs, and we do our marketing against jobs. And so we recently launched this thing called, a new inbox. As you can see it here, Meet Your New Team inbox. So down in the bottom left, we've just highlighted this thing that says, see who's handling what. That is directly a feature directly built against a job that we identified, which was people who use email for customer support were basically like emailing over each other. Right? A customer would email in, two people would reply, the replies would cross. Those guys look like a bunch of idiots because it looks like they don't know what they're doing. And the problem was, I need to see if someone else is replying. And of course, if you're two people are replying at once in email, you can't do that. And many other communication tools. So it's simple. And the simple thing was, well, let's just show if someone is replying. It's really simple. The product is simple. The marketing is simple. But because it's against a job, it was much, much easier for us to understand it and do it. So that's one example. So understand the job. Design for causation and not correlation. Look at what causes people to do things. Really understand the problem. Why are people switching from one thing to another? What's causing them to do that? Rather than correlation, which is what a lot of research studies do. They go out and look at the world, look at problems people have, and then correlate against patterns, and basically end up with correlated things, but not causal things. Okay, so the last thing, think in two timelines. This is, again, something I learned a lot about at Facebook. We think about two timelines at Intercom. We think about 6 months and 5 to 10 years. We don't think about 1 year timeline, 2 year timeline. I actually think a 2 year timeline is one of the worst ways in which to think about product development or service development. There are some examples where you've got supply chains and hardware and things, which is harder. But for software, certainly 6 months, 5 to 10 years. So to answer the 5 to 10 years question, you have to have a vision. You have to be able to look at the world and say, this is the change we want to affect in the world. So you need to be able to answer the question, why do you exist other than to make money? Turns out it's very hard for a lot of people to answer that. I've got some examples. I've got some examples here of missions. This is Facebook's. To give people the power to share and make the world more open and connected. Very, very good. It's very easy for me as a product person to be able to look at a bunch of features and say, does this help our mission? Does this make the world more open? Does this help connect people? If it doesn't, it can be an awesome idea, but somebody else should build it, not us. I had an interesting experience. I worked in Google+, and then left Google+, and I went to work at Facebook. And it was interesting to contrast those two and look at the missions that those companies and teams had. This was Google+'s mission. This is obviously slightly tongue-in-cheek. Some people are saying, oh, that's... so beat Facebook by copying them and doing it better. This is actually a legitimate product strategy called Fast Follow. Microsoft used it a lot. But the problem is that you can't evaluate product features against that. It sounds like every product feature is a good idea. You should build all the things, because all the things are going to help this mission. Right? It just doesn't help you focus. It doesn't help you solve the real problems that people have. This is Twitter's, to give everyone the power to create and share ideas and information instantly without barriers. It's pretty good. It's a bit long-winded, but it's pretty good. You can know whether your ideas help people share information. Instantly is critical. Clearly, it's not in Facebook, so speed is more important to Twitter than to Facebook. Hence, you see things like breaking news on Twitter more than on Facebook. This is Microsoft's, to enable people and businesses throughout the world to realize their full potential. Sounds nice. I'm not really sure how I would evaluate a product or a set of features against that. This is Intercom's, to make internet business personal. We believe it's impersonal. I won't get into all the reasons why, but it really helps us focus on what to build and what not to build. So 6 months, 5 to 10 years. For 5 to 10 years, you have to have a vision. And for 6 months, it's really simple. This is a chart, weeks from launch, how many iPads versus iPhones versus iPods were sold. The short story here is that technology changes so fast, so radically, in very short spaces of time, that having a 1-year plan, 2-year plan means that that plan is basically obsolete by the time it happens. So this is how we work. The next month, really concrete. We know exactly what we're doing. 6 months, we've planned. We know what we're going to build. That can change a little bit, but we generally know. And then we have a vision for 5 to 10 years. And as we keep going down that path of building, 3 months, 6 months later, we start to keep that 6-month timeline going. We adapt it if we need to. So that's it. Hopefully it's helped rethink how you think about the internet. It's so new, it's so young, the opportunities are so incredible. I feel very lucky to be alive in this job that I have and all of you have right now. I think we live in a very transformational time, and I think a lot of people don't necessarily see those bigger opportunities because we're thinking about today. That's it. That's a summary, about a wrap up. So please let me know if you have any questions afterwards in our Q&A, or just contact me on Twitter. I'm happy to help. Thanks.